What's up, heathens? How ya doing? I'm the Godless engineer, and I critically analyze apologist claims to give you the best arguments and information so that you can stand up and use your voice. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a video from Kyle Butt where he attempts to prove that Jesus definitely existed in history. I'm sure that you can predict exactly what evidence that he's going to bring up, but I figured that we would look at this video because he does bring up a lot of popular talking points when trying to prove that Jesus did exist in history. Keep in mind that Butt is a fundamental creationist Christian, so he's definitely going to be using things like the Bible in order to prove the Bible. I'm sure he won't be circular the entire time. So if y'all want to fuck around and find out what evidence Kyle Butt has for the historical Jesus, then please stay tuned.
Did Jesus really exist? 2,000 years ago, that question wouldn't have been asked. It would have been asked because Jesus simply was alive and he was well in a small village in the land of Israel. Had you seen him for yourself, you most likely would have considered him to be a very average-looking Jew. But he was certainly anything but average. He spoke like no other spiritual teacher ever had. He proclaimed himself to be the Son of God. He forgave people's sins while he was on earth. He foretold his own death, and he performed verifiable miracles that even his enemies couldn't refute.
Well, did he really though? I would love to know what your citations are for saying any of these things, because most, if not all of these things, come from the Gospels. The Gospels are not history. They are fiction. They're mythical tales about a person that supposedly lived about a lifetime prior to the people that were writing these Gospels. So no, none of that is verifiable history, let alone do we have evidence for verifiable miracles that occurred. I do love the bit of irony or hypocrisy here. I'm not sure which one, but Kyle Butt argues from the fringes position of even New Testament scholarship, while at the same time defending the mainstream New Testament scholarship position. It's kind of a weird situation that Kyle Butt finds himself in. I do find it very strange that people that were contemporaneous to Jesus when he supposedly existed never actually write about him being on earth. The only person that we have actually writing at the time when Jesus would have been walking around was Paul. And even he is writing 20 years after Jesus supposedly died. But Paul would have been living at the same time that Jesus was walking around Judea. The very fact that not even he references the idea that Jesus walked on earth and did any of these miracles or had any public teachings or anything like that, that is all very telling of the quality of evidence that we have for Jesus' existence. If you want to know more about how everything that Kyle Butt is going to be telling you today is complete and utter bullshit, I highly suggest you download my Crestus app. It's currently available on the Apple App Store as well as Google Play. Definitely go there, check it out now, and let me know what you think.
His life and death and resurrection were so powerful that he started a movement which remains in existence and continues to spread across the globe 2,000 years or so after it started.
Well, I mean, if all of that was really all that powerful, then why do we have 4 completely different gospel narratives about his death and resurrection? And I get it that they have this basic core that's the same, that the idea is that Jesus died and then he was entombed and then he resurrected and absolved our sins and everything like that. I get that there's that core that's still the same, but there's still 4 very different stories about it. So if this was at all powerful, then there really shouldn't be 4 completely different stories. This isn't even accounting for the multiple different gospels that didn't make it into the canon. There are so many different Jesuses that supposedly existed at this time with different tales that go with them that it's kind of hard to really figure out what Jesus actually did, if he were to have existed. Another thing to consider is that if Jesus' resurrection was really all that powerful and moving of a thing, why didn't it initially convince people? Because in the Gospels, at least the ones that have the post-resurrection appearances and everything, Jesus's resurrection didn't really convince a lot of people just on the mere resurrection by itself. Of course, later when Jesus showed himself, allowed that one guy to finger his hole, his side, the little wound in his side. I'm just saying that it took more evidence in order to get people to actually believe that he resurrected and everything. So it's kind of a weird situation there that you might want to consider.
Since millions of first century Jews lived, died, and faded away, just the fact that we're even wondering if Jesus exists says something about the truth that he did.
The very fact that we're questioning a historical figure means that he definitely did exist. I mean, we've questioned the historicity of several characters from the past, including the likes of Hercules and Attis and all that. Like, we've questioned their historicity. Just because we're questioning his historicity doesn't mean that he really existed.
But now let's get to the heart of the question. You see, there are some people today that have determined to deny and reject all things that bear any hint of the spiritual or supernatural.
Yes, those would be normal fucking people. I mean, it's not to say that Christians or those that think that supernatural things exist aren't normal. I'm just saying that, like, as far as investigating the supernatural, I feel like most normal people would be very adverse to believing in the supernatural. Of course, obviously, if it comes out of your holy book, that was definitely supernatural.
And for this reason, many of them not only claim that Jesus wasn't the Son of God, but they claim that he never even lived on earth.
Well, it's not because we have some kind of prejudice against Jesus or Christianity or anything, really. We just have a bias against bad historiography. That's what we have a prejudice and bias against. To frame it as we're just so anti-Christian that we even want to denounce Jesus' existence, that's really straw-manning, like the reasons why we doubt the historicity of Jesus. We doubt the historicity of Jesus because of the lack of good evidence to suggest that he did exist. Now, if you'll notice, I said good evidence. That means that it's not that there's no evidence, it's that there's not any good evidence to come to the conclusion that he did exist. Hopefully, Kyle will eventually get to some of this evidence that will point out why it's not actually evidence for Jesus existing. So I guess I'll let him continue.
With all due respect, this accusation simply is nothing short of wrong. Jesus' life is one of the most historically documented lives in all of ancient history.
But he really doesn't. He actually has the least amount of information about his life. I mean, even in your intro here, you talked about how Jesus was just an average-looking Jew. I'm sorry, but stating that Jesus was average Jew number 2 doesn't exactly describe Jesus, what he looked like, or even what he did. And without the Gospels, which are obviously fictional and mythical and stuff, with only the testimony of Paul, we hardly know anything about Jesus. But I do have a section in my app where I compare the evidence for Jesus with the evidence that we have for other historical figures. And you will find that the evidence that we have for other historical figures, like Alexander the Great, or Caesar crossing the Rubicon, or pretty much anybody from the past, you'll find that we have so much more evidence for those people than we do for Jesus. So no, Jesus is definitely not the most historically documented person in history.
Any person who wanted to discover the truth about Jesus' life could begin by looking at the books of the New Testament. When we turn to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the book of Acts, and the epistles that were written by Paul, we see that they talk about, they focus on, they center around the personality and teachings of Jesus.
Well, Kyle, I have to say, your list here is pretty fuckered to begin with. First off, you start with Matthew through Acts. Those are all fictional accounts. Those are not real historical documents, right? Now, I know a lot of people like Bart Ehrman will say that we can glean a lot of historical information about Jesus from those things, even though that they're fictional writings. The fact that they are fictional and we could not even attempt to discern fictional from non-fictional things in the New Testament, I feel like you really can't use them as evidence for Jesus, because we have no clear indication if anything in there even happened in history. The things that we are sure about that happened in history have corroborating sources outside of the Bible. So that's what you would need in order to establish that Jesus existed, is some kind of corroborating evidence that exists outside and independent of the Bible. And then we get to Paul's epistles, which is a fine list with the exception of 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus. Paul definitely didn't write those. There's a couple of others in there that are highly debated in scholarship, but in order to argue from the strongest position, we'll go ahead and lump those in with Paul's original epistles. But even then, you don't have solid evidence that Jesus actually existed in history. You actually have more evidence that Jesus was only ever a celestial figure. And I have plenty of videos on this channel where I explore and explain how Paul never places Jesus on earth. So all of this evidence right here from the Bible proving what the Bible says is just circular logic. Even if you try to just take Paul's writings and not all the other things that are in the Bible, he still only attests to a celestial Jesus. So that really doesn't help you.
But some people look at these books and they want to claim that you can't use those to prove that Jesus lived on earth because they're biased, because these books were writing in favor of Jesus.
Well, no, that's not actually why we would disregard them. We disregard them because there's no evidence to suggest that they were writing history. I mean, for Paul, I don't really have a problem with the fact that he's biased. We're just looking at what kind of historical information can we get from Paul's writings. And as far as the Gospels go, we can't use them because they don't cite any historical sources that actually existed on earth, except for the scriptures. They heavily use and cite the scriptures. But you really can't use the Gospels and Acts in order to justify that Jesus existed on earth when they only have the scriptures as references. Likewise, Paul, he even separates himself from any human source for his knowledge about Jesus. He claims that the only way that he got his information about Jesus was through visions and through reading the scriptures. So basically, he got really drunk one night, read the scriptures, and was like, oh yes, obviously this Jesus guy absolved me of my sins. And, now he's a Christian. So just to recap here, lack of sources, lack of citations to real historical sources, those are the reasons why we don't trust the New Testament canon about Jesus.
This claim fails for two reasons. Number one, the writings of the people who are claiming that you can't use biased writings, well, their writings are biased.
Okay, so you basically constructed a straw man argument, and then you brought up one point against that straw man argument to knock it down. Good job?
And so would they say we could throw out their writings because they're biased? Sauce good for the goose is good for the gander. They would not think that their writings should be thrown out, and yet they say you should throw out the New Testament documents. Simply not a tenable position to be in.
Well, I mean, true, but you just made up that position, and then you knocked it down, and then you you patted yourself on the back for knocking it down. I mean, this just seems like a giant ego stroke right now.
And second, the New Testament documents are, even from a secular point of view, the most historically reliable documents ever penned in the first century.
Go on. Try to justify this. Go on, please.
World-renowned archaeologist Nelson Gleck once said, "It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. Scores of archaeological finds have been made which confirm in clear outline or exact detail historical statements in the Bible."
I like how he has to bring up a quote from somebody in 1959 in order to justify his understanding of the historicity of the Bible. For one thing, archaeological advancements have only contradicted the Bible. I mean, maybe they have proved certain places existed or certain places had been destroyed and stuff like that, but I mean, the number of archaeological finds that contradict the Bible are mounting constantly. One of those things would be the size of the Israelite people, or where the Israelite people even came from. Like, who on earth did the Israelites actually destroy? Because the people that are supposedly utterly destroyed in the Old Testament, we've been able to find their descendants now. So, no, this is just totally wrong. And he's using a quote from somebody living in 1959, who's coming from a place of limited knowledge, at least compared to what we know now about that time and place. What this really boils down to is using an appeal to authority. What Kyle Butt is doing is he's appealing to the authority of this Nelson Gleck. But the problem is that Nelson Gleck, he said this back in 1959, so it would really behoove Kyle Butt here to provide us with what evidence Nelson is talking about, because that evidence could not prove the things that he's saying. We could have discovered new evidence that would override his opinion in 1959. So we would need what exact archaeological evidence Nelson is talking about here in order to know whether or not that's an informed position. All Kyle Butt is doing is saying, hey, this guy's an archaeologist. He says that the archaeology actually proves everything, sometimes in exact detail, that's in the Bible. So obviously, archaeology proves the Bible. That's not true, though.
You see, the Bible is accurate history, and it documents the life of Jesus Christ at length. You know what, though? Even if you didn't have the Bible, although we do, and it would carry the weight of the case by itself, even if you didn't have those documents, we would still be able to establish the fact, the historical fact, that Jesus Christ lived.
Another thing that you're failing to mention here before we go on to these external sources is that you said that the Bible is one of the most historically reliable books out there or whatnot. But what you don't tell people is that Nelson Gleck was actually also a rabbi. So when he talks about verifying the Bible, he's most likely talking about verifying the Old Testament, not the New Testament. Because we don't have any archaeological findings that actually prove any of the major points in the Gospels or in the New Testament in general. Most of the time when we talk about archaeological finds in the Bible, we're talking about the Old Testament. You just automatically assume that somebody says that a portion of the Bible is entirely accurate because of some archaeological finds or something, and then you apply it to the entire Bible. That's fallacious. I didn't really see how Kyle Butt defended his position of the Bible, even from a secular standpoint, being all that reliable. Because, I mean, he used a rabbinical archaeologist in order to prove his point. That's not exactly secular. He didn't bring up any other kind of secular information that would support the Old Testament of the Bible or the Bible in general. He just pronounced it as an unsubstantiated claim. That would be called ad hoc. All right, let's get to these extra biblical sources he's talking about.
A man by the name of Josephus, he was a well-known Jewish historian. He mentions Jesus twice. He wrote about a man named James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ.
So, yes, Josephus is one of the popular pieces of evidence for Jesus existing, but the problem is that Josephus is highly contested. Both references in Josephus are highly contested in the scholarship. A lot of people like to say that there's a redacted version of the first passage, the Testimonium Flavianum, that exists in Syriac and Arabic. But in fact, Alice Wheatley proved that those versions only ever trace back to Eusebius. So Eusebius is our only extant version that has ever existed that we know of. So we can't presume that an earlier redacted version of the Testimonium exists and that there's only a small portion of the Testimonium Flavianum that was edited or changed by later Christians. We have to take the entire passage because the entire passage as it exists now is the only version of it that has ever been known. It seems to me like it'd be highly unreasonable to remove the portions that make it uncomfortable and then say that Josephus wrote that originally. There's no evidence to suggest that, so it would be unreasonable to suggest it. But taking the Testimonium Flavianum at face value, there's no way that Josephus could have written it. I have plenty of videos on this channel, again, where I've already covered the reasons why we can't trust this Testimonium Flavianum. The second portion I've also covered a number of times. Most likely, the original text was not referring to Jesus as the Christ, but rather Ben Damnius, because later on in the passage, it actually references Jesus yet again, placing him in the position that his brother once occupied. So it makes a lot more sense. It's more parsimonious to assume that it was a Christian interpolation for many reasons, but it makes a lot more sense to assume that it was a later Christian interpolation that put the Christ in there.
Additionally, the Roman historian Tacitus wrote in regards to the originator of Christianity. He said, Christ had been executed in Tiberius's reign by the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, which is virtually the exact same statement that the New Testament documents make.
Which should be a red flag for you. If Tacitus is saying the exact same thing that the New Testament states, and Tacitus was writing in the 2nd century, which he was, then it seems to me that he was probably using the New Testament in some kind of fashion, either directly or indirectly, most likely indirectly through Pliny the Younger. Tacitus was probably just relaying what common Christians believed at the time and not making some factual statement about what happened in the early 30s AD. There is a really good argument to say that this was an interpolated portion of Tacitus's work, but even if you take it at face value, all that does is put Christians in Rome in 64 AD. That's it. I don't have a problem with that. No mythicists out there would have a problem with Christians existing in the 60s.
Now notice how Tacitus marked the life of Jesus. He marked it by the emperor of Rome time period and the governor of Judea. Now, what are we saying? That's exactly how a Roman historian who would be writing historical information down would have documented the life of a Jew living in the 1st century.
It's also how Luke describes it, which would have been readily available to Christians by the 2nd century. So all you're really doing at this point is solidifying the fact that Tacitus was most likely informed by the Gospels in one way or another. Like I said before, most likely through Pliny the Younger, who was interrogating Christians, and so Pliny probably told Tacitus about this group of people.
By the certain period of this Roman emperor and by the period of the governor of Rome that was there in Judea. You see the situation there. That's not overblown writing. That's not biased in favor of Christ. It's just simple, historical, accurate writing.
I don't know how you're getting that it's accurate. It's accurate when compared to the Gospels and what they say, but none of that information is contained within Paul's work. It just seems like Tacitus was getting his information from Christians of that time being the 2nd century, and by that time they would have known about Tiberius and Pilate, and that whole story would have been told to them at least 3 different times.
There was another Roman official by the name of Pliny the Younger. He wrote in about AD 110. In a letter to the Emperor Trajan, he mentioned Christ 3 times. There again, Romans simply mentioning the life of a 1st century Jew.
Well, yes, but you're not telling us why he mentioned it or what the context was in him mentioning it. These are important things to discuss when you bring up Pliny the Younger, because Pliny was interrogating Christians in the 2nd century, and those Christians were telling him about their Christian faith. And so Pliny was writing to Trajan asking, well, what have they really done? I mean, I'm imprisoning them, but I don't see anything wrong with them believing in some Jew resurrecting from the dead. I feel like you not bringing up the context of Pliny's references to Christ is very suspect and kind of makes me think that you're purposefully leaving it out. Either you feel that it's not all that important, or you know how important it is, and you're leaving it out because it would definitely ruin your case that Pliny references a historical Jesus. Because all Pliny the Younger was doing was talking about the beliefs of Christians in the 2nd century. He wasn't writing a historical record of what happened in the early 30s.
No, make no mistake about it. Jesus lived on earth. There's no serious question from any historical view about that.
No, an actual historical view, there is certainly question. Any historical figure in the past is up for question as to whether or not they were actually historical. And it's because of the evidence that we don't consider some people to be mythical and that we believe that they were definitely historical. People like Alexander the Great. We know that he existed in the history because we have biographers from hundreds of years later that were using firsthand accounts of Alexander the Great. We do not have that here for Jesus at all. So it really doesn't matter like how long after Jesus' death somebody supposedly wrote about him. What we would hope they would use are firsthand accounts that Jesus actually walked on earth.
In fact, just notice the calendar. What do the years 2017, 2018, 2019, 2020, what do those mean?
Oh, I know where he's going with this. We've covered it before, but I guess that this is a really big indication for him that Jesus existed. I'll let him finish before I tell you why this is horseshit.
Well, the letters AD stand for the Latin terms Anno Domini, meaning in the year of our Lord. All time revolves around the fact that Jesus lived.
The Gregorian calendar starts its positive timeline with Jesus' birth. That doesn't mean that it actually happened. And the reason why this argument is by far the worst argument to use to prove a historical Jesus is the fact that Pope Gregory the 13th is the one that commissioned it to be created. Now, if we were to really think about this, if a pope created a calendar system, what point in time do you think that pope would anchor his calendar to? Kind of seems like the birth of his savior, right? Because he definitely believed in the miraculous birth of Jesus, and he definitely believed it happened in year 0, even though 0 isn't really a year on the timeline. It's just sort of the 0 point where Jesus is born, I guess. But 0 is not a point on the, timeline. But in any case, that is where Pope Gregory the 13th decided to start his calendar at. And so all time is measured around that supposed event. And what's funny is that even by the Gregorian calendar's timeline, Jesus wasn't born at that point. He was either born in 6 AD or in 4 BC. Another thing to remember here is that BC and AD aren't really formally used anymore. It's BCE and CE. That would be before the Common Era and the Common Era. So it's just ridiculous to say that the calendar proves that Jesus existed in history.
Jesus was a historical figure who lived in first century Palestine. His faithful followers died martyrs' deaths because they preached that Jesus lived and that he rose again and ascended into heaven.
Well, but those Christians that were martyrs come much later in the timeline for Christian history. The originators of the Christian cult, they definitely weren't dying as martyrs. Not even the apostles were all dying as martyrs. There is some scholarly debate on whether or not Paul died a martyr. We don't get any kind of clear indication from Paul's writings, which are the only trusted writings really in the Bible. We don't get any kind of indication from his writings that he was dying as a martyr or that he was ever given a chance to renounce his faith and he didn't, or anything like that. We have no clear indication that any of the early Christians died as martyrs. So that really doesn't matter when we're talking about the historicity of Jesus, because of the fact that by the time Christians were dying as martyrs, they wholly believed in the faith. They completely took it as either historical fact or spiritual truth, probably both. But the fact is that they knew nothing different. They didn't know that it was possibly made up. They didn't know any of the things that we know now. So it's not that they were dying for a lie or anything like that if Jesus didn't exist. They just completely believed in his existence and absolution of sins.
Oh, he lived on earth. And he still lives today in heaven, and he's waiting to return and take his followers back to heaven with him.
Whew, he is taking his precious fucking time, isn't he? I mean, we've been waiting for going on almost 2,000 years now. You think that he could move his ass a little bit?
Will you be one of those followers who understands the historical reality of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, and understands the future reality that Jesus Christ will be here once again to take his faithful back to heaven?
I mean, maybe if you actually had some kind of historical evidence to suggest any of the bullshit that you just said, maybe then I would consider it. But that's just me acknowledging the existence of Jesus and not really succumbing to the whole Christian faith thing. I definitely still wouldn't be like a Christian. I would just believe that Jesus existed in history. All of the supernatural shit that you just said right there, none of that is true by all indications that we have. We don't have any evidence that like there's a life waiting for us after we die, that we don't have any indications that Jesus was actually the Son of God. We don't have any good evidence to suggest any of those other things that you suggest are real.
Make no mistake, Jesus lived, and he's coming again. Will you be ready?
Are y'all going to be ready for the coming of Jesus? Y'all best get your raincoats on, because I hear that Holy Spirit is a sprinkler system. Well, heathens, that's going to be it for the video today. I hope that you guys appreciated it. I know that a lot of these apologist videos concerning whether or not Jesus existed kind of get redundant after a while, but I feel like it's still important to push back against new videos that are put out by Christians who think that they're making good points. I would think that even by New Testament scholarship standards, nothing that Kyle Butt has said in this video is all that scholarly and is not backed by the current mainstream scholarship, with the exception of the idea that Jesus existed in history. One of the few points that I think that most mainstream New Testament scholarship would definitely agree with him on would be the Josephus passage, but I really think that that's probably the only one that you could really get behind. Not even Robert Van Voorst agrees with Tacitus or Pliny, proving that Jesus existed in history. And he's a mainstream New Testament scholar that I happen to agree with on those particular sources. So it seems like in Kyle Butt's video, he's really only got one source that mainstream scholars would back up as proving that Jesus existed in history. This video really does seem to be a dud. And like I said before, I know that it's kind of repetitive, but it's important to keep pushing back against bad scholarship when it's presented. And in this video, it is nothing but bad scholarship. But I would love to know what you guys think. So leave me a comment down below. And hey, while you're down there, why don't you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of video. And hey, if you're interested in this topic in particular, definitely download the Crestus app. It's got a lot of great information in it. All of the information that we covered today that proves that Kyle is wrong in this video is contained in the app. So definitely download the app today. But before you do that, make sure you stand up and use your voice. Bye, heathens.